afternoon, and welcome to Preserving Black History in the Archives, the Legacy and Future of Rose Library's African American Collections. I'm Jennifer King, the director of the Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library. A few notes of gratitude are in order. Thank you to the Emory University Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Paul Bassine, Director of Orchestral Studies at Emory, for that beautiful rendition of Winter from Vivaldi's Four Seasons. And thank you to our co-sponsors of today's program, Emory Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Arts at Emory, the Emory Black Student Alliance, the Emory Department of African American Studies, Department of English, and Orchestral Studies in the Department of Music, Bronze Lens Film Festival, and the AJC Decatur Book Festival presented by Emory University. I'm so pleased today to introduce our new curator of African American collections, Dr. Clinton Fluker. Clint was previously the Assistant Director of Engagement and Scholarship at the Atlanta University Center's Robert W. Woodruff Library, where he supervised the Archives Research Center and the GLAM Center for Collaborative Teaching and Learning. He was the Outreach Coordinator and Open Educational Resource Specialist at the Emory Center for Digital Scholarship, and prior to that, a curatorial assistant in the same African American collections in the Rose Library, over which he now assumes this leadership role. Dr. Fluker earned his BA in philosophy from Morehouse College and his MA and PhD in American Studies from Emory University. Clint, welcome. Now, a bit about today's program. The Rose Library has several collecting areas: literary and poetry collections, specifically in British and Irish literature, political, social, and cultural movements, and Emory University's institutional records, to name a few. Today, the library is hosting a dedicated conversation to contemplate and explore the significance of the African American collections, which are at the center of the Rose Library's mission to promote access, learning, equity, and justice by documenting, preserving, and making accessible distinctive and diverse collections. In 1968, African American undergraduate students at Emory called for the creation of a Black Studies program. Their demand was part of a nationwide student struggle to expand the curriculum of higher education in the United States. 4 years later, in September 1971, the Black Studies program began its first year under the leadership of Dr. Dolores P. Aldridge, establishing what is thought today to be the first Black Studies program in a higher education institution in the Southeast. In 1942, Emory University formally created a special collections department within the library, which now holds over 2,000 archival collections. It was in 1997 that we established a dedicated curator for African American collections position, hiring Dr. Randall Burkett, a position that Randall held until his retirement in 2018. Randall was succeeded by historian and Emory alum, Dr. Pella Mcdaniels III, who earned his doctorate at Emory and returned to Emory to become Randall's associate curator and then curator. We were all devastated in April of last year when our inspiring and visionary colleague, Pella, passed away at the young age of 52. In addition to being a year of mourning, this year has also been a year of profound commitment. We are galvanized by Pella's passion and vision, and honoring his passing, we are engaging in today's conversation to chart the future of these critical collections while we consider the past. The African American collections at Emory include materials in the areas of art and art history, religion, theater, civil rights, sports, music, literature, business, radicalism, Black print culture, and many other areas. Our standout collections include the Camille Billups and James Hatch archives, the Atlanta Daily World records, collections of James Weldon Johnson and Carter G. Woodson, and the papers of Alice Walker, Lucille Clifton, and Kathleen Cleaver, among many others. Joining us today are guest speakers who will reflect on these collections. We are joined by Crystal Edmonson, our moderator, and Atlanta Business Chronicle broadcast editor, Emory alumna, and an Emory Board of Trustees member. Dr. Valerie Babb, Emory's Andrew Mellon Professor of Humanities and African American Studies and English. Dr. Carol Henderson, Emory's Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion and the Chief Diversity Officer and Advisor to the President. And Christell Roach, a poet, MFA candidate at the University of Miami and 2019 Emory University graduate with a BA in Creative Writing and African American Studies. And Dr. Clint Fluker, the new curator of African American collections in Emory's Rose Library. In addition to our esteemed panelists, we will be unveiling a portrait of Pella by the Atlanta-based artist Keith Cross, who created the wonderful portraits of artists, authors, and activists for our traveling exhibit, Speak What Must Be Spoken. And without further ado, thank you all for being here today. And Crystal, thank you. I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I too look forward to this conversation. I know it's going to be a robust discussion about the value of the archives at Emory and how we can really bridge the gap between what we have at Emory to the broader community, the Metro Atlanta community and beyond. So I'm excited about the conversation that will come out of our time today. And I'd like to pose the first question to the new curator, and welcome, Clint, Dr. Fluker, to Emory. Because you're new, we give you the first question. And that first question is, you know, with you not being a stranger to Emory, you've certainly been exposed to the archives many, many years ago through as a student, a graduate student, but also just throughout researching and looking at the archives. And I wanted to get your impression of Emory's archives, your first impression. What was your first impression of Emory's archives? What did they mean to you as a graduate student? And how does that shape how you think about them today?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for having me here today. I'm glad to be on this panel with these amazing people. And it's just always an opportunity, a great opportunity to talk about and to share with everyone my experience with Emory's archives. I just love them. And so my initial impression was like, this is amazing. I guess I could tell you a little bit of a story around how I came into the archives and became a curator, and that hopefully explains a little bit of my impressions. First and foremost, my introduction was really as a graduate student at the Institute for Liberal Arts. And I was a starving graduate student. I needed a job. I mean, it was really kind of simple. I came walking into the library, and by chance, I was placed with Randall Burkett, who was the curator of African American collections at the time. And I have to say, like, his enthusiasm, his excitement over the collections was just infectious. And he took me to one of the floors where we had the unprocessed periodical section, where it's just hundreds and hundreds of documents floating all over the place on these shelves. And he's like, put them in alphabetical order. That's your job. And I was like, oh, okay. and I found that it was actually just so exciting to just sort of look through these different documents, look through these different journals, look through these magazines. And the piece that was more powerful for me was that one of the reasons I came to Emory initially to the Institute for Liberal Arts was to work with Dr. Rudolph Byrd, who had passed right before I got into the program, actually. And Dr. Byrd, a very significant scholar in American Studies at Emory and the James Weldon Johnson Institute, for sure. But one of my first assignments was to organize his personal library to make it easier for the archivists to do their very important work for processing. And so I kind of saw it from that perspective first. You know, it was both exciting and then also meaningful to me. But to kind of broaden that picture, as a graduate student, I was constantly just reading canonical texts, right? You go to the classes, you read the important things, and you're trying to forge connections to more contemporary research. And so when you walk into the archives and you can pull out Alice Walker's, notepads, or you can look at a Camille Billups print in person. These are just amazing experiences. But then these collections that Emory has, even further than that, they attract other people to them. So as I'm reading about important African Americans in history and culture, suddenly they show up in the archive, like literally walking in the building. So one day I'm reading about Carrie Mae Weems, and then she's in the building. Or the next day I'm talking about Deborah Willis, and I'm like, oh, wow, she's here. Theaster Gates, Amos Kennedy. So for me, the archives is just a place filled with opportunity and an abundance of content. So I guess in short, my first impression of the archives is that they're dope.
Simply put, they're dope. I want to open the discussion up to some of our other panelists. Dr. Henderson, can you talk a little bit about your personal connection to the archives at Emory?
Yes. So first, thank you so much, Crystal. And I want to say welcome again to Dr. Clint Fluker. We are excited to have him here to work with us. Like his experience, my experience to the archives centered around my connection to the For Peace I Rise initiative that wanted to create a musical on the life of Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian. And so I tell the story before I even landed here. Chris Davis reached out to me on LinkedIn and said, listen, we have this project that we're thinking about putting together. We know that Emory has the papers of Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian and his wife, Octavia Vivian. Those papers not only talk about the civil rights movement, but also tell their love story. They were married for more than 58 years. And so we have this wonderful resource here. And Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian was 96 years young, and we wanted to honor his life. And so when I had not been on the campus, I thought, wow, I knew of Emory's archives. I knew of their stellar library resources. And I thought, what a great opportunity to build bridges between Emory and the Atlanta campus or community writ large to participate in this process. And it was wonderful. The musical, we were able to stage a reading. Tom Jones, who was the one that wrote it, spent time in the archives, read, listened to tapes that are there of Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian for meetings, read some of the love letters, and really got a chance to get into the mind of Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian and take the journey with him, all the luminaries he was able to get in contact with, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Dr. Joseph Laurie, among others. And so to see the archives be the impetus for creativity and innovation, and to see that end product of this musical, which was 3 to 4 hours long. It was a long musical, but it was beautiful, original music. We were able to connect with other actors and actresses at not only Emory's campus, but some of our neighboring institutions. And so it became a community effort. And then to be recognized by the Georgia Senate and with a resolution, we had city councilmen present persons there. That's how I came to the archives. I saw them as a living entity, something that allowed us to build bridges, inspire others, and it became a record of a human experience where we were able to take something material and create something creative that lives. And that initiative is continuing. We became the impetus for that, but they are going to the point where they want to stage this musical in the Atlanta metropolitan area. So I feel very fortunate that Emory was able to be a part of that creative process.
As you talk about creative process and that really innovative and creative project, I can't help but segue to Christell and the work that you're doing, being an Emory graduate, 2019, and working in creative writing. I want to ask you how you use the archives, but I think more importantly, you found yourself repeatedly going to the archives when you were a student at Emory. Tell us what kept drawing you back to the archives.
I found myself in the archive like my first semester at Emory. I took a class with Kevin Young on the lyric, and it was in the Rose Library. And not only was it the like prettiest classroom I've ever been in, I got to work with so many primary resources that I was just like holding journals, holding books, holding so many sources that I never would have encountered before. I don't think I would have. And I was really like completely mind blown by that, to see a writer in process in the archives. And I think through taking a lot of classes in African American studies with like Dr. Gordon, Dr. Warren, and even having a relationship with Pella Mcdaniels, like I was introduced to the archives again and again, that I found myself coming back just hungry, coming back looking for language, looking for conversation. And so a lot of my most revealing writing, I guess you would say, came in the archive, because I felt myself in conversation. So I could completely understand what it's like to be in the archive and to be working with all of this historical material, and just to just build bridges between time periods. That's what I love the most. And to be able to create from that, it's comprehensive storytelling. And it's what I love the most. Actually, there was a poem that I remember writing while I was in the archive, and I was actually looking at Alice Walker, a photo album that she had. And I'm looking at photographs of her mother. I'm looking at photographs of her when she was at Spelman College. And I was so moved by the way that she spoke about like art being like a calling. And it was a poem that I actually wound up sharing at the university, which was and I got a few awards for it, which was On the End of Mango Season and Still Falling Fruit. And it was the first time that I wrote about something that I lived through, wrote about being home in Miami, picking up mangoes in my backyard, and my dad's swimming laps, and we're watching the news, and this boy has been on the ground for hours, and he's no longer with us, and we're just watching this happening. And it was something that I felt written into the present, and it wouldn't have happened if I didn't start in the archive. So the archive has become so integral to just my writing process that I find myself going all the time. And especially as like the youngest of a very big family, someone who was born in the wake of so many of my own elders who I lost, I find myself constantly seeking the stories, constantly seeking the intimacy, and just being in conversation. And I think that's kind of the magic of the archive. You can't tell me I don't know Alice Walker. We'll probably meet her. We'll probably meet her someday. I'll be like, it's nice to see you again. I've never met her in my life. But the archive, it has that effect that it's a series of love letters from it, whether it's curated in an exhibit, just like the first exhibit I saw at Emory, which was the Billups Hatch exhibit that Pella Mcdaniels did. And I remember being there, and it just felt so intimate and open and inviting that I felt like as an artist, I was supposed to be in the archive. I was supposed to be surrounded by all of these elders and ancestors who their work was there for us as like a love letter. So I will say that the archive has been integral to my process, as I said, and I'm really passionate about it. I find myself going to UM's archives and going all over and coming back to Emory for the archives because it's just incomparable. So
It sounds like it's a very personal connection that you have, and several of our panelists have mentioned that. And Dr. Babb, I want to turn to you because I want to change the question a little bit and ask you, do the archives serve a different purpose in your life personally than maybe as a researcher and then as an educator? Do you tap into the archives in different ways for those different purposes?
Absolutely, Crystal. And that's why I'm so grateful to curators like Clint and to our wonderful archivists at Emory, because the way they have gathered and preserved those materials allow me to enter them on these different levels. Certainly, as a researcher, the archives allow me to test my ideas. So I can go into the early Black print culture collection with an idea of, oh my gosh, Phyllis Wheatley had so much against her when she was writing. And she was drawn before this tribunal of white men that included judges, slaveholders, to prove that she could have written the poems that she wrote. And then I look at her journals and they move from center stage and she becomes a center actor as I read the discipline, as I read the imagery, as I read the imagination there. And so it is just wonderful to have her become the center of this history. Personally, being at a predominantly white campus can be somewhat isolating for a Black professor. And what the archives provides me is the ability to have conversations. Rather than scream at the top of my lungs as I walk across campus, I can go into the archives and find communion, community, and some quiet. I remember once looking at W.E.B. Du Bois's copy of David Walker's Appeal, and in the margins, Du Bois has these light pencil lines where he is pointing out the passages that meant most to him. And it becomes a three-way conversation where Du Bois is reading Walker, I know Du Bois and Walker, and now I'm reading them both. And I'm almost in conversation with them and isolation just disappears. So yeah, I do access the archives in many ways, but I think it's because Emory's archives are so complete that I'm allowed to do that.
Okay. You mentioned a couple of things in your comment, and I want to turn the conversation to Dr. Henderson with the thought of using the archives as a bridge between, say, Emory and the broader community. I want to ask you, how do we do that? But then why is that important, especially now?
Well, now, and I think my colleagues have spoken to this, is if we want to create identity or conversation, if we want to remind people of who they are and where they get their source of strength, the fact that their journey is part of a continuum of struggle, that at different ebbs and flows in our historical record, we can see ourselves in that moment, and then what our legacy and responsibility is to continue that conversation, as has been mentioned. That is where the archives are important. I also know that when we talk about access, Emory sits in a particular unique position as an institution of resource. And if we have archives that we can make available, and I know that Dr. Pella Mcdaniels really believed in this, that the archives were a way to create conversation with our students. When I'm thinking of how he took exhibits into the high schools and elementary schools and encourage students to look at who their ancestral line is and how they too are kings and queens. They too are brilliant innovators. They too are creative artists. That is what that archive is important for. The archives are central to creating that dialogue, and they are not to be closed. Archives are not about closing off information. It is about making it more readily available, whether that is in person, and I know that's been hampered now because of COVID-19, but there is a new day coming. So I do see an opportunity where we'll be able to get back into the archives, but that may be digitally as well, when we need to create resources so that our brothers and sisters who are in South Africa or in Brazil or Latin America can have access to what we have been gifted. I also, because I believe and I know I see this from those who hold these archives dear, we have a responsibility to maintaining and preserving, as we continue in our mission, to create applied knowledge in the service of humanity. So archives are very much core to that.
Yeah, yeah, and really connecting, whether it's digital or in person, when we can do that, so that people have access and the archives are accessible. Not only is accessibility important, but Dr. Fluker, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask a little bit about the importance of staying abreast or even sometimes getting ahead of some of the shifts and waves of what people are researching. What people might be researching now is probably different, maybe a little bit, than what they were researching, say, in 1990. Different time, different topics that were top of mind. Can you talk about the importance of making sure that the materials stay relevant to the community, and how we go about doing that?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I believe that one of the great things about the archives is that it helps you have a long memory, helps you understand the importance of history, and that history is not static, it moves, it shifts. And so while thinking about things that will be useful in the future, it is not at the expense of those things that have already been collected and set up the foundation of what the archives is, because it all flows together. You can't tell the story, one part of the story, without the other. So I just have to say that in the beginning of this statement, because I think that that's really important. You only know what's important to collect moving forward because of what has happened in the past. And you also see this as a professor, when you're in the classroom working with students, whether it's undergraduate or graduate. What's great is to kind of see what they're interested in, where they want to see things go, and how they're looking for materials and resources to kind of help them tell their best stories. If they're artists, and if they're scholars, how they really craft new theories of discourse and practice. So we, at the archives, we really want to make sure that we keep up with their most innovative and expansive thinking. And in this way, I think that we definitely want to continue collecting in Black print culture, political, civil rights organizations, Black church materials, literature. This is the strength of our collection at Emory. But to continue telling the full picture, as Dr. Babb was talking about earlier, of a complete narrative. We never finish it, but we always have that as the goal. In order to continue to do that, we need to think about moving forward with things like hip hop culture, for example. This is Atlanta. We're in Atlanta, and hip hop is intertwined into the very fabric of the region. And so by collecting in this area, and we've already started that, but by collecting in this area, we're not just doing it for research purposes, it also connects us to the community, and to the greater Atlanta area, and makes us a destination for people who are interested in that kind of work. There's some other areas that I think are very important now. There's a lot of conversation about Black speculative thinking, Black speculative fiction. We see this in the popular culture, whether you're looking at an HBO series on Watchmen or Lovecraft Country, something like this, Black Panther. But there's also a long history of this kind of thinking that in the literature goes back as far as we've been writing. And in the thinking goes back at least as far as the Middle Passage. So I think that we want to make sure to tell that story as well. And in doing so, we really bring in an incredible group of people and some really special kinds of projects for the future, the things that Dr. Pella Mcdaniels was really all about.
And it's really interesting to think about, sometimes in the present we think, oh, this is a novel idea. Oh, this is a great idea. I'm so glad I came up with it. And then you go to the archives and you realize, oh,
Right.
somebody else thought about this 300 years ago. This is not new at all. But it is a bridge to sort of to see if there's some connection there where you can say, maybe mine is the next chapter in this idea that I have. Maybe I'm putting a modern spin on it. So whether it's hip hop or any other idea, it's building on something that came before. And like you said, it reaches, the potential to reach new generations of people who would visit the archives. I was going to say youth, but it doesn't have to be people who are young. It could be people of any age who are visiting the archives for the first time or second time, and maybe a third time, to learn something new and to build on the previous experience or the previous visit. So a lot of potential there, with things that Atlanta and the archives are already pretty strong in, whether it's politics or civil rights. But then there's room, as you mentioned, for new areas such as hip hop, and really drawing other people into that. With that said, Christell, I want to get your take on something that you mentioned a little bit earlier about using the archives in your writing and really finding a connection there, with the work that you're doing and the work that you're studying even now. Can you talk about specific ways that you use the archives in your writing?
Yes, I think I can best describe it in using Alice Walker's words when she was describing her relationship reading Zora Neale Hurston. And she said, I'm paraphrasing, reading her, she saw for the first time the remains of her literary country, the old country, as it were. And she did not condescend to them, and she did not apologize them, and she was them delightedly. So reading that, that's how I felt in the archive, writing. And I think Dr. Babb said about the silence. I really enjoy that as well. I would go to the archive to write, because I felt myself really tapped in to this literary country, where even if I have one person before me, or just a photo album before me, or a legal pad that has notes from The Color Purple or something, I just felt myself like I had a huge word bank all around me. And so when it came to writing, I always found myself like reading and then reading and writing, because I had questions. That was something that Dr. Pella Mcdaniels said I always had questions. And actually that was how we first met. I was on the second floor library and I was writing, and I ran into him, and then he's just like, you look like you're thinking about something. And we wound up, he showed me the exhibit, the Billups Hatch exhibit. I bombarded him with 1,000 questions. He taught me in like 5 minutes what a ring shout was, told me about Mari Evans, told me about Alice Walker's archives, told me about all the Black women writers and their archives inside of the Rose Library. And then I just knew, I'm like, I got to get up there. And so getting up there, I found myself, as I said before, in conversation, but in such a sacred way that I do think I think sacred is the word, because it's like you go to a different space, and it's a creative space, and it's in the words of Catherine McKittrick, it's almost like a demonic space, as in everything's alive. And I think that when it comes to stories and storytelling, I loved them so much growing up, because when my father was telling me a story about my uncle, or when my sister was telling me about our Nana, they were still alive. And so reading in the archive, when I say I'm in conversation, it's because everyone's alive. I'm looking at I'm getting kind of emotional even talking about it, but I remember looking at a catalog of people inside the archive. And I always felt very far removed, like I didn't belong. Growing up, for example, in a place like Miami, which is so diverse. I didn't know where my place was. I didn't know how I belonged here. But I think I say our archive, I'm at UM, but the Rose Library's archive taught me how to reckon with that belonging, and to go back to my own family's photo albums and oral histories from the women in my family. And And it got me into a place where, talk about speculative fiction, I'm writing, I'm creating, and where there was absence or loss, I could fill in the blanks. And it was spiritually advised, it was researched. Everything that I write comes from research. So in the archive, I think that the archive really plays into my writing process because it gives me the words. I go in there and I don't really go in there with the intent to write. Writing happens in the archive. I think it's engagement. So that's why I hold it so dear. And I think when we talk about like Emory and homecoming, like for me, homecoming, going back to Emory is going back to the archive. Because so much is changing all the time. Like I feel most at home in that archive. So yeah.
Well, I love that. I love the sense of feeling at home in the archives and feeling safe and inspired to write, even though you don't go there to write, but you do end up writing once you are there and being creative and finding a sense of home. I want to shift the conversation just a little bit from a very personal connection that Christell, you've mentioned and others have mentioned, to Dr. Babb, turning to you to talk a little bit about the archives as a source for research, specifically as we think about some of the modern conversations that we're having in society, whether they be, conspiracy theories or other tough conversations. Can you talk about how the archives might serve as a source, a resource, when you think about these types of conversations? How do we tap into the archives in these spaces?
Yeah, I think archives make it very difficult to make things up as you're going along. And if I could wish something for every person in this nation, it would be access to the archives. That's why I think it's so important that these be digitized, not just for educators, but for every single person so that they can know of themselves and where they fit in larger histories. One of the things my students are most fascinated by are looking at archives of old statutes that define what is the appropriate behavior for an Indigenous person, what is the appropriate behavior for an African person in the Americas, what is the appropriate behavior for white ethnic people who have just arrived from Europe. And one of the things they see is how this idea of race was constructed by the people who needed to construct it for their own benefit. It's difficult to argue the superiority of one race where you can go in an archive and see one date where it doesn't exist, and then one date where it does exist and has the power to really shape and impact human life. So it's hard to maintain a lot of notions if you have the information that archives can provide. When you see not only what someone was formally said in a speech or written in an essay, but all of the little notes that can appear in archives, in recipe books, in albums, on the backs of photographs, you see how complex human beings are. You see how thinking about one another is a process all the time, always engaging. And so I think it's important for us to see that, and then that can kind of lower the volume or lower the heat on a lot of the strident, if I may, stupidity that tends to surround us in this particular moment.
Have you ever been shocked by something you read in the archives or a comment in a speech or something? Have you ever just clutched your pearls and said, oh?
Yeah, well, I actually thought that it would be great to write a gossip book on archives because you do stumble across some incredible stories, but then you have to pull yourself back and think, well, what larger purpose would this really serve to know about? And I won't say any of it here, but do contact me if you want some of those deeper stories. But yes, I have been shocked on that level. And then also just shocked at some of the arrogance that I have seen statesmen express, and also the hypocrisy. Reading someone like Benjamin Franklin, who has such a great, strong idea of why we need to be a country that accepts all people, but personally is really repulsed by the idea. So it really does kind of reshape your whole idea of not only who these historical actors were, but also what is history, who told it, who gathered it, who held on to it. And making archives public, shaping, and as Clint was pointing out, always moving, always in tune to time, gives us that advantage point to see that nothing was written in stone, nothing was absolute or correct, and we need to process this so we can understand who we are now.
Yeah, always evolving, always
evolving.
flowing. Similar to that point, Dr. Henderson, I want to ask you about the role the archives play in interdiversity competency.
Yes, I think they're key. One of the things that has come up in the conversations of key stakeholders on campus is students' ability to know about place, not their place, but about where they are learning, the land they learn on, which there's conversation about land acknowledgements. The history, we're going to continue the work that colleagues like Dr. Leslie Harris and others began around Emory's history and slavery and how that has impacted the ways in which our structures and what is the influence of that world on the ways we interact now. And so you're right. When I think of intercultural competencies and think of the fact that students have the opportunity to have access to something like the archives. One of the most painful things, and it didn't happen at this institution, so I'm not talking about Emory students, but I had in my previous iterations, I knew of a student who admitted they hadn't been to the library in their 4 years of education. And I'm thinking, so what major were you in and who were your professors? But because everything is moving digitally, sometimes there are opportunities where people don't have to go to the libraries because they can go online and get all that information. We are so fortunate with what we have here to interweave into the first year experience, for example, a connection to the Rose Library, or to talk about a topic and have students needing to look at the materials and have the experience Christell has had where you're in conversation, student activism, when you think of activism and what could be in the archives connected to activism and the civil rights movement, or how do you record this moment now? When I think of COVID-19 and our racial reawakening, how to process that and how art and literature are part of the language we use to tell that story. Sometimes when it's even inaudible or emotional, having the archives present to show how others have taken that journey does not mean you have to replicate that, but that again, you're in conversation with that. So for you to when I think of diversity competency, when I think of how you apply knowledge, when I think of perspective taking, when I think of global knowledge, all of those things can happen if you're present in the archives to understand your position in that larger historical conversation. So I think it's a missed opportunity if we don't do that. And I can tell you as an educator myself, that is something I'm looking for. How does diversity, equity, and inclusion live in the educational spectrum? And how do we make that an active part, not something acted upon people, but something people are active in, so that it has deeper resonance with the work that we're trying to do on social justice and racial equity.
And Clint, I want to kind of continue that conversation with you. How do we sort of make sure that there are no students who don't set foot in the library or give themselves the opportunity to go to the Rose Library and learn about the archives and the African American collection? How do we bridge that gap for students?
I think that there's several ways of going about this, but one thing that stands out to me was really what Christell said earlier about, she corrected herself. She's like, my or our archive. And I know it's, no, but that's actually the point. We want it to feel like it is our archive. And that includes not just the Emory community, but also the community writ large of people who want to engage with these kind of materials and this kind of history and culture. That's the objective. I think that Dr. Babb pointed to this as well when she was talking about the need to make things accessible. Making things accessible in one regard, first and foremost, does mean, in a broad sense, digitizing these materials. Because if people can't have access to them online, especially during times like COVID-19, then we really are. It's a disservice to the collections themselves, but also it's just really difficult for people to find and use them for research purposes. But a level beyond digitizing materials is to craft specific kinds of programming, specific kinds of engagement opportunities where you create that feeling of collective understanding and feeling around the materials. And that really happens in person. I think that when we talk about the kind of conversation that we have with history, there's power in these physical materials. It's not something that you can only do digitally. Especially where people are talking about their personal relationship to the archives, I'm Black. And so when I go into the African-American collections, for me, it's more than just research. And so I'm in conversation, which is the language that's been used, but often the fragmented history of Black people in this country and in my own history is kind of hard to wrap one's head around. But when I'm touching these materials, like if I have the book with Aaron Douglas's print on a Harlem Renaissance text, if I can see that, I can look inside and see the book plate and I see the little annotations. It's like those kind of things that coheres that fragmented history for that moment, for me, in a way that is more than academic, more than intellectual. And so we want to create those kind of experiences for people so that it's not just a lot of me going out there giving talks about it or, being like, you really need to get in that archive, because that's what every professor does. They do that. It's not just the professor's fault. They try and tell you.
Yeah.
But we also, it's incumbent upon the people who work with the materials as well to try and create those kind of experiences, because that's when people learn to go themselves. And you don't have to prod. They feel a connection that they have to draw back constantly. And so for me, when I think about the different platforms in which we can reach people, it's certainly there's exhibits, there's digital exhibits, certainly there's documentaries, there's short films, there's poetry. I think that the whole approach of working to build community around the archives is one that engages all kinds of cultural experiences. And that is what Emory has done historically around the Afro-American collections. And I'm really quite wowed by it. And I want to continue doing that with the great team that we have.
So that there's something for everyone there to get something when they do visit the Rose Library, the African-American collections. They see something that they can really connect with.
Right. Absolutely.
Christell, now you have mentioned you're a writer and you've talked about your relationship with the archives and the writing that you do. And I'm just curious that as you grow in your craft and as you pursue writing, do you at some point hope that your writings will end up in the archives? And what would you hope that someone would be able to draw from your writings?
So it's funny that you say this because I actually started to keep all of my drafts of my poems and everything. I'm like, I have to keep this. So my entire room is just stacks of papers. I'm like, I just have to keep this. I have to have it. And I realized that what I get from even having it is I saved that poem and I found myself doing something that Maury Evans did that I didn't even notice I was doing it until I'm like, why am I doing this? And there was a photograph with a poem that she was writing. And so I found myself, I was writing one day, I'm working on my thesis right now. And as I'm working on my thesis, which is a poetry collection, I'm like, I was after this image, and I'm like, I know what I'm trying to say. And I know this image, it was about family. And I'm like, I'm trying to get this person. And then I go back to what I thought was a poem. And then I open this folder and there's all these photographs. And I'm like, this is the imagery, the concrete language. This is the, talk about a word bank. This is like the image bank I needed. And so I would hope that if anyone ever saw my mess of an archive, they would see that it's okay to be in process. That's what I love the most about the archive, is in seeing how these writers that I admire, especially like Mari Evans and Alice Walker, who I spent a substantial amount of time in their archives, seeing what makes it to print, seeing what's different inside this publication versus that, seeing their notes in the margins, that I think it gave me a lot of permission that, oh, it doesn't have to be perfect. Oh, it doesn't have, like, sometimes it is what it is. And so I think in being in process, it taught me to really not rush that process, but also to enjoy how I got there, because I got there through the photographs. I got there through readings. I got there through so many different avenues that they're equally as important as the final product. So I think that's really important, especially when you're like pushing out poems and writing. I always say, like, there's so much more to writing than books. And there's so much more to reading than simply writing. So that whole process, it's like fostering a reading culture. And that culture is something that I think is really key to spark in other people. And I think when you see it in someone else, it'll really help you to give yourself permissions to just explore on the page. So
I like that. The really value in the journey, not just the finished product. Speaking of journey, in the few minutes that we have left, and thinking ahead to the future, I'm wondering, and I'm posing this question to each of you, and I'll start with you, Dr. Babb. What opportunities do the archives still hold for you? Are there things that you haven't discovered, or you want to, the reason you go back? Are there opportunities that come to mind for you, Dr. Babb?
Yes, I'm reminded of Amiri Baraka's phrase, the changing same. And it takes inspiration from that old saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So I am looking for new iterations of the things that we are very familiar with. Clint spoke so eloquently about how archives will expand. I'm curious to see how they expand. Are they going to be completely different, or are they going to engage things that seem very, very familiar to us? And that excites me quite a bit. And just on a technical level, I am fascinated by the journals that authors write, by the letters that they exchange. What is that going to look like in the 21st, 22nd century? How do you archive tweets? How do you archive text messages? So I'm also just curious as what will archives look like, and how will I be able to access them? So I guess when I think about the future, that's what comes to mind for me.
Yeah, there's gonna have to be a way to archive tweets. I mean, so much has happened.
Yeah.
Somebody will figure that out. Dr. Henderson, talk a little bit about the opportunities as you see them that the archives still hold.
Many, and I think the archives will give, at least for me, a way to think about the infrastructure of diversity, equity, inclusion. I know that sounds broad, but when I think about our educational mission, how that is stood up in the ways we learn. What does equity look like in the archives? How even in the African American archival collection, what does diversity look like in that? I think it's been spoken to, but when I think of the ways in which we learn, everyone doesn't learn by reading. Sometimes we learn, we have people that listen, that's how they learn tactile. And so the ways we learn, how will the archives encourage us to be innovative and creative in the ways we learn? And what does inclusion look like in the archives? What is that for someone who is disabled? Or how do we have it accessible for them, and the ways in which they process information out of the archives? And then, for me as a leader, and then of course, justice being the common thread. You can't have an African-American archive without thinking about justice, social justness, and what that looks like, and how we build community. When I think of what community means in the archives, everyone has spoken so eloquently about that, but how we continue to look at not only our localized community on our campus, but then our regional community in the greater Atlanta and even Georgia area, and then our international community. What is Black in the African-American archives when I think of the international experience of people who hail from different areas of the planet and globe? And I know they're all in there, but it's how do we pull out those threads to weave this transformative experience, not only for students and not only for faculty, but let me add this other thread layer, which is how do we bring staff into this conversation? When we're trying to enact transformative change, we often leave out the staff. And staff are learners. They're broad thinkers. They want to think of ways in which they can engage in their work in this educational process on campus. So how do we, in making the archives accessible to everyone else, think about our own home space, and how do we connect staff members, administrators, that the archives will influence the way they administrate on campus? I mean, I think sometimes we're so siloed in the business of education that we don't think of the learning process of education in the business operations that we have. So how can archive? I know that's a lot. I'm not asking Dr. Fluker to come up with all the answers to that, because I will partner with him on this, but I'm really thinking about
I got you.
But I'm thinking of how can we creatively, in ELMS or Canvas or in our learning apparatus, broaden the perspective of our staff and how they apply and make this accessible to them. So it's just all of those things. It's just a wonderful gift the archives are to us. A wonderful material gift that keeps on giving. And the last thing I'll say is, how do we collect? I know when I was working with Dr. Pella Mcdaniels, people whose ancestors, so I'm thinking of folks whose grandmothers had collections in their basement, how do we then serve as this pinpoint to help them understand how to preserve, create, and tell the familial story, which is also part of the larger ancestral story, and is the larger story about human experience, but also the American narrative told from a different lens. So you can tell I'm excited about that. So I will shut that down right now, but thank you for the opportunity to answer that.
I love that, the thought of that, of going in someone's, grandmother's basement and finding all these pictures or notes or letters, and understanding that has tremendous value too. And Dr. Babb, you were going to say something?
No, I was just telling Clint that between Dr. Henderson's request and my request about new technologies, he should feel no pressure whatsoever.
I don't have my notepad out, but mental note. Come right here.
They are filling out your agenda for the next, 5-10 years. But to that point, I mean, in all seriousness, Dr. Fluker, what opportunities do you see to build out the archives in the future? And what's on your list of things that you say, I really want us to go after this, or I really hope we, can secure this? Talk a little bit about that as we close.
Right. Thank you. There's at least a couple of things that are on my mind. And first and foremost, I like to think about making connections to what's happening in real-time history. You know, as a journalist like yourself, that's something that you're so familiar with, is like, how do we tell history in real time? What I'm interested in is we've had these amazing movements that have come about in recent years, Black Lives Matter, for example, and a lot of political movement around the work of people like Stacey Abrams, for example, in Georgia, and how to create connections between what we're seeing with that kind of work and work that's happened in the past, so that we are using archives in an effective way. I think in this way about taking Stacey Abrams' organization, and how do you put that in the context of voting campaigns around like the Voter Education Project, and just sort of make those connections for people to be like, this has happened before. How are we learning from the past, and what makes certain things successful and makes things not successful? William Barber and the work that he's doing with the Poor People's Campaign. How is he working with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s work on the Poor People's Campaign specifically? Do we need to go back to those texts and like look through that kind of work? So for me, when I look at Emory's archive, I want to do a lot of my own personal research. This is the opportunity for me to kind of see how I can make connections through what's inside the archive and what's happening today. And that's how we begin to build this community that we were talking about before. So people recognize the significance, recognize the importance of why they need to go to the archive to learn, but also to do their own work in whatever field it is better. So that's the first part. Another part that I wanted to think about was something I spoke on earlier, was the need to use different parts of culture to tell this story. I think that when we're talking about Twitter and Instagram and things like this before, there are people in the community across the country, across the globe, who are archiving, but they're doing it in different ways than maybe what we're familiar with. So when we talk about, the notepads and the letterhead and the postcards and things like this, that's one way of archiving, but people are still collecting the work in a digital format. And we have to find innovative ways of pointing to that and learning from how curators of a different kind are already doing that. So I just want to make sure I'm in line with what they're doing as well. I like to learn from a lot of different spaces. And then I think there's a great quote from a collector, famous African-American collector and curator, Charles Blockson. There was a documentary a while back where he was talking about his interaction with rare books and manuscripts, and he said, "These are my friends." Like that's how he saw it. I want that for people. That's the opportunity I'm looking for, is like, how do we showcase that these are materials that are not where, people like me go in with elbow patches and tweed just to dust off the materials. That's part of it. And I love it, which is why I'm here. But also these are alive and vibrant stories to be told. They're my friends, and they can be yours too. So that's the goal here. I hope that answers your question. I had a lot of things I was trying to wrap in there.
No, that definitely answers the question. And I think you really helped to bring us full circle, which is with our first question of asking, how do you personally connect with the archives, and what do they mean to you personally? And it sounds like your wish, and what all of our panelists say, is that people find that connecting point for themselves at Emory and beyond in the community, and making sure that the archives are accessible to a diverse group of people so that they can tap into them and continue the story, right? Continue to use that as a foundation, but the stories continue. So with that said, thank you to all of our panelists for being a part of this discussion. I know I learned a lot and better for it. And at this time, I'll turn the conversation back over to Jennifer King for closing remarks.
Thank you to our moderator and our presenters, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I am energized by this discussion and the opportunity to welcome Clint and to be working together in service of preserving and promoting the archives utilizing and documenting technology to build community and advance humanity. As we wrap up, I also want to mention that if you are so inspired, you might consider making a gift to the Dr. Pella Mcdaniels III Research Award Endowment. This fund supports awards for Emory students, faculty, and staff, and visiting scholars to conduct research and undertake creative projects utilizing the Rose Library's collections. The work that results from these awards will continue Pelham's efforts to document and celebrate African American lives, history, and expression. Please go to engage.emory.edu/McDaniels to make a gift. We hope that you enjoyed today's program and that you will go to our website at libraries.emory.edu to learn about all of our events and exhibits. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Keith Cross, and I'm one of the artists that Mr. McDaniels picked to do the Billups and Hatch exhibit. That's how I first came into contact with him through Clint Fluker. And I remember getting an email one day from Clint saying that, first of all, saying that he was from Emory, which already kind of set me aback because it's Emory, you know? And at this point, I had just been doing a lot of local shows around the Atlanta art scene, kind of building a name for myself that way. In addition, I also had a comic book called Day Black that I wrote and illustrated. And that was actually what prompted Clint to reach out to me because he happened to be a fan of the book. So he told me what Mr. McDaniels was trying to do. And he said that he was looking for, or actually by this time I had already met Pelham. And he told me what he was trying to do was integrate comic books with Black history and just certain historical figures to try to get the students a little more engaged and excited about the topics. And I remember the first time I met Pelham, it really surprised me because even though he was a big dude like me, but when I saw the pictures of him playing football in his office, it really just, it was so interesting to me because he was so sharp and so intelligent. And of course, I'm ashamed to say I fell victim to the stereotype about athletes and being the opposite of that. So Pelham automatically kind of impressed me when I first met him. I was like, wow, this dude is like really got it together. Like I've never met someone on top of his game like this, but so physically imposing. It was just some juxtaposition going on that really stood out to me. But aside from that, just the fact that he reached out to me, or I guess just the fact that he reached out to me based off the strength of a comic book. And I was like, wow, I'm really working for Emory right now. I'm really drawing these incredible figures, a lot of them that I knew and I admired. You know, that really humbled me. I never thought I would be there from a comic book about a slave that turned into a vampire, you know? So I was really humbled that he put that trust into me. And what he did, and he probably doesn't even know that he did this, was he brought out a style that I used in my comic book, but I never really used it in a realistic sense. So as I'm creating these pieces for him and for Emory, I'm really learning as I go. So I think I did one piece and he loved it. Then he commissioned me to do a few more, and it kind of just kept going from there. And we did a bunch of different pieces. And the thing that's so ironic about me doing his portrait after he transitioned was that I was using the exact same style that he helped me perfect in hiring me to do these commissions. So when I think about Pelham, I think about where he took my visual aesthetic as well as my pedigree as an artist in Atlanta, you know, from going from one stage to graduating to another level where people that may not have known me kind of know who I am now just based off the affiliation with Emory. So I'll always remember him from that and remember him for that and appreciate him for bringing me into this arena. So thanks a lot, Pelham. Rest in peace.